Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is what is now become a monthly Feminists for Liberty virtual panel series. This is our second one this year. I don't know why I had to say that. Of course it is. It's the second month of the year, and I just said they were monthly. But we are very excited about this topic tonight. We are going to be talking about free love. I'm just going to give you a real quick little introduction about what we mean by that before we introduce our panelists and then get to the questions for them. And at the very end, we will open it up for audience questions. So just to start, you know, when we hear the words free love, I think that most of us think of like the boomers and hippies in the 1960s and things like that. But actually the term free love gained popularity more than about 100 years before that. It was a term that sort of gained, a term and a movement that sort of gained popularity back in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. It was not just about promiscuity or polyamory. It was much, much broader than that, and was about sort of all different forms of separating the state from sex and marriage and reproduction and family life and relationships. And creating the conditions that would make this separation possible. So this included things like pushing for women's rights, because at the time women weren't allowed to own property or have any legal rights to their children, or have their own economic, have their own money once they were married. They lost the right to all of that. So it was about giving them the rights to do that. It was about people having the right to say no to sex once they were married. It was about divorce rights, which were not very, prevalent at the time. You had to really do a lot to be able to prove that you were worthy of getting a divorce. It was also sometimes about equality within relationships and how to make relationships between men and women in heterosexual relationships more equal. And some people were actually, all about abolishing marriage altogether and, abolishing the nuclear family in favor of a sort of communal living unit. Some people were all about polyamorous relationships, but it wasn't exclusively confined to that. And a lot of the groups that, called themselves free love advocates were not pushing that at all. It was something that was embraced by a wide groups of people, including socialists, anarchists, communists, liberals, Christians, feminists, abolitionists, and much, much more. So it wasn't just sort of one stereotypical group of people that embraced this either. Some names you might have heard of that were popular proponents include Victoria Woodhull, who was the first woman to run for president, Emma Goldman, famous socialist feminist, John Humphrey Noyes, who founded this crazy utopian Bible communist community that believed in complex marriage, which was just like open poly marriages on this upstate New York farm, and now they are a silverware company. Like his descendants are the people that make silverware. Yeah. Ezra Haywood. There were a lot of anarchists and socialists. Socialist was, sort of a different term back then too. So when they say it, a lot of them were sort of maybe more libertarian socialist is what we would say today. Even though I know that sort of seems like an oxymoron. But anyways, there wasn't really any one sort of person that pushed this. And I just think it's really fascinating, this history of it. The term sort of, fell out of favor for a while and was revived in the 50s and 60s. At this point, we see a broadening of the movement somewhat. We see people fighting for gay rights and sex worker rights to an extent under this umbrella, although also not a lot. And this is something we're going to get into a little bit more. And also just sort of fighting for people to be able, especially women, but all people to be able to enjoy sex without these confines and constrictions and stigma that was so pushed on them before. So tonight we're going to be sort of taking those concepts of these previous free love movements and talking about sort of how they translate into our lives today. And so, without further ado, I'd like to, I'm just going to, have the panelists introduce themselves. And I'd like if you guys could each tell us, who you are, what you do, or sort of what your maybe politics are, and just a little bit about your context, your relationship context. Like what, are you married or not? Just anything. Are you, do you think monogamy is viable? Just a real quick sort of anything you think would be relevant to this discussion at hand that you want to share with the people out there tonight. And we will start, because I'm looking at this, we'll go Maggie, Christian, Liz, and then Kat.
Well, then I'll start. I'm Maggie McNeil. For those who don't know me, and for those who don't know me, I'm a sex worker. I have been a sex worker for a very long time now, probably before some of you were born, 1985. I've been full-time since the late 90s. I owned my own escort service at one point. I just now semi-retired in January, so I'm only seeing regular clients now. I've been doing activism, sex work activism, since 2004, and I've been writing a daily blog since 2010. And I've been in a lot of shows and podcasts and radio programs and written some books and all that sort of thing. As far as, besides being a sex professional, my own personal sexuality, I have identified as kinky and queer my whole life. Sometimes more bisexual than at other times. I've been married a couple of times. I've been in some more or less sort of committed relationships. Back in the 80s, I was doing what we used to call open relationships, but of course nowadays it's called polyamory. So, I mean, kind of the gamut. I mean, I'm even kind of familiar with, and I'm one of the people that Liz didn't mention, Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, of course, was another free love person. My first degree was in English. And so when I studied the Romantic poets, you know, we really read a lot about that stuff. So I'm kind of interested in touching on that. I think that's everything. Or no?
Yeah, I should say when I was talking about when it started here, I kind of meant in the United States, but obviously there's a much further back history to this sort of thing too. So thank you, Maggie, for bringing that up.
Hi, I'm Christian Hertenstein. I'm a public relations professional in Washington, D.C. I help people get noticed in the D.C. press when they have advocacy and cause issues. I was delighted to be added to the panel. I think as a single, well, currently single gay man, it's just giving a little diversity of perspective here. I have been in several monogamous relationships. I've also been in relationships where we practiced polyamory with rules. And more than anything, I think what's great about this conversation is opening ideas on positive sex, because oftentimes negative views on sex are what lead to dangerous behaviors.
Thank you. Liz?
Oh, Liz is muted. I
Liz,
will go in the meantime while Addison turns your mic back on, Liz. Sorry about that. So I'm Kat Murti. I'm the Executive Director of Feminists for Liberty. I live in the Washington, D.C. area. And, you know, I'm a libertarian and a feminist, which is probably pretty obvious from that job title. I am in a heterosexual marriage. Big fan of marriage personally for me, I will say. I often like to tell people I think that marriage is one of the best decisions you can make if it's a good marriage, and if it's a bad marriage, it's one of the worst things that could possibly happen to you. So that's sort of the perspective that I'm coming from. I am legally married, which as someone, I'm an anarchist personally, it was a difficult decision for me, but something I think that we'll be probably touching on a little bit more later on. I don't believe that the state should have any role in marriage. However, I feel like I should add the little asterisk here that the state does have a role in my marriage, because whether or not you choose to acknowledge the state's role, it tends to wiggle its way in there regardless. So that's sort of the entryway into my thoughts on this.
I'm Liz Wolfe. I'm a staff editor at Reason and a Clubhouse aficionado burgeoning. I spent my time between New York City and Austin, Texas, and I am in a heterosexual marriage. I am married to a man and have been for a little bit more than 2 years. We cohabitated before that for maybe 4 or 5 years. And yeah, I am also legally married according to the state. The state of Texas tells me so, and I think that's recognized in the other states as well. It was definitely a little bit disconcerting for a libertarian to get married in a way that's legalized by that's recognized by the state. And my husband is a libertarian too. So we decided to go to a shooting range and shoot guns right after. So that did sort of slightly balance it out.
Done that,
A little bit more comfortable.
Brilliant.
It was definitely the right move. But then again, it's not like the state really recognizes like you know, acquiescing and ceding power and control to them in one area, and then you trying to, you know, relish your rights in another area. Like, it's not like it balances it all out. But yeah, we're also in a monogamous marriage, and I have lots of friends who choose the poly route, lots of friends who choose the monogamous route, lots of friends who are ultra devout atheists, and some who are ultra religious. So I feel like I have, you know, people in my life coming from all different perspectives, which is really interesting.
Thank you. And I just realized that I did not actually introduce myself at the start of this panel. So I should say, I'm Elizabeth Nolan Brown. I'm the president of Feminists for Liberty. I'm also a senior editor at Reason magazine. If I guess maybe I should, because I made everyone else do it, I should say like some context too. So I will say that I have mostly been in heterosexual relationships throughout my life, but not exclusively. I've was in monogamous relationships mostly throughout my life until I was about 30. And then I was like, this is causing trouble all the time, never again. And that's been the case. I am now I am now married to a man. He is wonderful. We did not get legally married, even though we had a giant wedding about 3 years ago, but we have not yet done it. We keep saying we're going to if it ever like becomes advantageous in any way, but there's no particular reason it has been. And to be honest, it was just like really annoying to go down and get the license. So we didn't do that. I have been involved in sex work at various points in my life, but not for a long time. So I too have sort of run the gamut of different kinds of relationships and sexual experiences throughout my life, even though now I'm pretty much very, very boring in everything and normie in everything that I'm doing at the current moment. So anyways, so without further, I keep saying without further ado, I'm sorry, I get nervous when we first start these things. Anyways, we are going to start with the questions now. And we're going to start by talking about something which we were actually just several panelists mentioned, which is the state's role in marriage. I'm going to throw the question to Liz Wolfe first, even though you were just sort of talking about it. But do you think the state should be involved in marriage, and why or why not?
So I majorly struggle with this one because I think, and I know this is a cop-out answer, but I think my reflexive classic libertarian response is no, of course not. People ought to, you know, enter into consensual, private, individual contracts, you know, of their own volition on their own timeline. And I think we also see a really good example of people like civil marriage and religious marriage are two entirely different things. There's something absolutely beautiful about the religious contracts that people enter into, you know, regardless of whether or not the state recognizes them. So often that's more meaningful for people because it's not like the state is some sort of higher power that really imbues marriage with any sort of clear meaning and clear roles and a clear concept of the cosmic significance of it. That's what your religion or your belief system does for you. So I sort of have long been in favor of private contracts outside of recognition from the state. But then there's also this component that I really think about, which is, okay, the terrifying thing about marriage is that you often have joint responsibility for children, not always, and you often have joint responsibility and sort of stewardship over your money. And so the state is put in this incredibly difficult role when people want to divide and there's not really a clear legal mechanism for doing so. You could solve this problem by having these private contracts very explicitly deal with these two thorny issues. But there's some amount of oversight that happens if you basically then mandate that all these private individualized contracts also deal with the question of what happens with the money and what happens with the kids. And as a lover of both money and kids, I really, really care deeply about these questions. And I think most people do. There's another component to it, which is that I think there are somewhat, I think people would fail to outline these things, which is important. There's also the component, not just in the context of divorce, but in the context of death. It's sort of important for people to have some sort of outline or format to figure out how to adjudicate these things. But the big caveat to all of this that really I think is the easiest thing to sort of center in on is we have to remove the social engineering marriage incentive bullshit from the tax code. I think this is especially relevant right now because we see Romney's plan floating around, we see Biden's child tax credit plan. And we could make state involvement in marriage, if we have it at all, a little bit more bare bones and a little bit more simple, as opposed to sort of saying, you know, attempting to nudge people in one direction or the other. I think it's especially interesting. You see social conservatives getting really, really worked up and freaked out about marriage rates are declining. But the thing is, we don't really see a huge decline of people choosing to consensually cohabitate and share their lives with somebody. And so I'm really curious about whether or not, people have sort of found value and significance in those types of relationships for a long time. What if we removed some of the tax benefits to that? That way, those couples who partner and live together for a long time would also be able to reap some of the benefits and feel more comfortable engaging in, entering into these contracts, but without having these weird social engineering tax incentives to do so.
Does anyone, do any of the other panelists want to add to that or dispute any of that?
I would like to add to that, with the caveat that Liz and I do not have that different of ideas on this, I think. We're also, so Liz, I believe you're a Christian. I'm a Hindu. I got married in India. I got married in the United States as well. And for me, definitely because most of the folks that I know here in DC came to the wedding in Maryland. I think that they look at that as like, that's the wedding. And that is actually where I got legally married. For me, marriage has never been about the state. I very aggressively feel that the state should not be involved in relationships at all. They are. And I think that you came up with some very good reasons why they should be. But for me, it was very much like the religious marriage and the getting married in front of everybody, making a certain commitment in front of everybody that you're saying that like, look, I've invited everybody I respect, and here is my vow that I'm taking, that I'm staking my honor as a human upon. That's what mattered to me. So certainly I don't believe that the state should have a role in marriage, but the state does have a role in marriage. And the state has a role in marriage because it's a part and parcel of every little other policy area, right? So this was a very difficult decision for me to look at getting married from on a legal perspective. That was something, for one, that my husband was interested in. He's also a libertarian, but it was something that he was interested in doing. And two, there are a number of benefits. I was also particularly interested from the immigration perspective. We're both US citizens, but we're both also dual citizens with other countries. And so that was definitely a part of it for me as well. And certainly some of that other stuff is baked in. What I do think, I want to comment on this point in particular, is that, for instance, when we were seeing the fight for same-sex marriage, and now what I think should hopefully be an upcoming fight for plural marriage to be legally recognized, there's always people that you hear saying like libertarians should not be arguing for this because you're growing the state, but you're not. The state is actually actively working against these types of relationships, and they're privileging certain types of, generally speaking, heterosexual monogamous relationships that involve one partner working, one partner not. You mentioned the tax system. There's also benefits when it comes to Social Security and things like that that push people into these very specific roles. That they have children, they own a house, one partner works, one partner doesn't work, and that they follow these specific roles. And the fact that that is already happening, if there are benefits around this, if there are anybody getting privileges through this, it should be open to all relationships. But I completely agree that we need to be taking as much as possible the state out of these relationships. But generally speaking, when I hear people arguing that the state shouldn't be involved in marriage, which I do personally believe, they usually mean except for all those heterosexual marriages that I'm just fine with.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's a huge issue. I think the state currently and historically has had such a narrow and restrictive view of who is allowed to get married. And it's just astonishing to me that that doesn't make more people question why the state's adjudicating these things in the first place.
I mean, Elizabeth and I are both in interracial marriages as well. I mean, for me, perhaps it's a bit different because we're both different shades of brown. But, that wasn't legal for a very long time, too. There's any number of ways that the state uses these contracts to try to socially engineer what types of relationships are acceptable and what are not.
Well, you even think about sort of like the origins of like marriage catching on in the US in like I'm thinking like the 19th century. And this was partially in response to Mormons moving into Utah and engaging in plural marriage. So there was this like moralistic origin where basically the state was like, we have to start creating, you know, legal civil marriage contracts in order to make sure those crazy dudes don't marry all the wives. And then there was also this component to it, which was like military pensions and people dying in the Civil War, and the government basically being like, okay, well, we need to give this to next of kin. And so we need to have some sort of system for recognizing these marriages. From a libertarian standpoint, like these are terrible, terrible reasons to get involved in the first place.
I'm glad you guys brought up plural marriage, because that was actually going to be my next question, and start with Maggie on this one. But
Well, it'd be okay if I say something about the last one too, and then you can ask me and I can go, you know, my personal, I might be a little less radical and a little more radical at the same time. I feel as though there is a role for government in marriage, but, and there's a huge caveat there, only in its capacity as enforcer of contracts.
Yes,
So
I agree
that-
with you, actually. I should have been clearer. Yes.
Yeah, because not in a role of regulation, but in a role of, you know, if you've agreed to this, and this, then you need to be held to that. But here's the deal. I feel as though the government should not have the right to set sex of the participants, number of the participants, conditions of the participants, length of the contract, or any other factor up to and including whether or not there's sex involved. Because why in the world, and I've said this in my blog before, why do we give precedence socially to relationships in which two people, and only two people, habitually boink each other? I mean, what difference does it make to me what some other people I don't even know of in Nebraska, whether or not they habitually shove their body parts into each other's orifices? I don't care. Why can't marriage be open to small groups of siblings, friends? You know, my primary relationship right now is with my best friend. We've never had a sexual relationship of any kind, but in some things for insurance and such, I've got her listed as my partner, because that seems to be the only way that people recognize that there should be or can be some kind of bond, deep bond between two people that could be contractually recognized.
Yeah,
So
and I liked your line about two people boinking each other, because what a lot of people forget too is for a very long time, adultery was also a crime.
Sure, exactly. You know, but when you see these things, and I really started thinking a lot about this during the campaigns for same-sex marriage, because we were, of course, obviously, everybody had to euphemize it. So we saw these things like legalize love. It's like, why does love have to mean sex? And not only that, but why does it have to mean a specifically rigid, monogamous sexual relationship that, you know, that you've been basically giving a fucking license by the government?
And why is marriage always about love? Don't get me wrong. Yes. I think love is a very lovely thing, but it's not the good basis for marriage.
No, not at all.
What Maggie said, though, I mean, this perspective, I think, was really ignored in a lot of the media around marriage equality, but there were a number of queer activists who were very concerned about what this campaign for marriage equality would do to queer communities and sort of erase queerness as we know. And that was ignored. And so, but you're right, it was euphemized. We said campaign for love. But the whole problem from my perspective with the fight for marriage equality was all driven around state benefits to marriage. I don't believe that the gay community would have organized the way that it did if they weren't made second-class citizens by how the state had tied benefits to it. Mm-hmm. And then people were upset because it was going to redefine it. And now we look at public opinion polls, and an overwhelming majority of Americans, I mean, shifted overnight into having no problem with it.
Okay, Liz. So now you ask your other question
about plural marriage.
Well, no, I was just going to ask what I think mostly people answered, which was, you know, should plural marriage be legal? And
Hell yeah.
everyone has sort of talked about that already. So I'm
No, but I think that there's
to the next.
people ask about why, and I don't think it's
Okay.
just about the relationship. And I think we're kind of building to a good point here, right? Like, yes, I think that anybody who wants to enter into a contract, providing that all of the parties are agreeing, obviously, if two people are in a marriage contract and then one of them wants to contract with someone else and the other one objects, that's a different situation, right? But if everybody agrees, they should be able to construct that however they want. But there's also aspects of how the law works now that are often overlooked when we discuss this. Increasingly, these laws aren't enforced, but bigamy is still illegal. It's a felony. If you mention, just simply, it's a freedom of speech issue amongst other things. Like if you mention the fact that you are married to more than one person, not only can you go to prison for it, and everybody who's involved could potentially go to prison for it, but there are policies where the children of that setup are split up. They're put into different foster care homes. They're not allowed to see each other until they're adults. It's really horrible. And I feel like these are issues that get totally overlooked as well here. So I think for a lot of reasons, this is really important. People have this idea of what multiple marriage, plural marriage, polyamorous marriage, polygamous marriage, however you want to put it, those are all slightly different, but what a complex marriage, what it looks like. And I think that image is very much like a very patriarchal, like Utah compound somewhere where it's a bunch of young girls who have no choice, who are being married to one older man. And I'm not going to claim that doesn't happen, but that's not what I'm talking about when I say that should be legal. That's not what a lot of times fully consensual. I'm talking about consensual relationships that could occur in any different permutation of genders or sexes, or have very many different views and roles for how the different people within that should work. So I think that's also something that gets so erased in this conversation.
Well, I think that's such an, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh,
No, you go ahead.
I think that's such an interesting point, just trying to basically like consider, okay, maybe like in my view of the state's intrusion and recognition of marriage, which I think it ought to have some role. Part of the concept is, ensuring it's that there's clear rights in terms of who has responsibility over children in the event of divorce or death.
Yes.
You bring up such a good point, which I think is just a crucial facet of this, which is that when the state does crack down on marriages that aren't acceptable in their eyes, so often it's not really children that win. It's children that are shuffled to foster care homes, or in other ways, separated from the people that they call parents, however many people that may be.
Siblings.
Yeah, and their siblings. And so there's this component to this, which I think people assume that the flip side of the government swooping in to rescue people from this, improper arrangement, I think they assume that means, overall better welfare, improved welfare for all participants. And oftentimes that's not the case.
Well, here, the other thing, how sometimes on Twitter, you see these things like state your most libertarian position and your most authoritarian position. My most authoritarian position is that the marriage age, the age for these contracts, why is it that you cannot legally enter into any other form of binding contract until you're 18, except the most binding one of all, marriage? And I don't see that personally. My most authoritarian viewpoint is that marriage, the age for marriage should be 18. You shouldn't be able to legally enter into a contract any younger for that contract than for any other contract. And so that's kind of what goes into what, like Kat was saying, once you've got the argument, oh, well, it's going to be this patriarchal thing in a compound in Idaho. Once you get that out of the way, and you say that the participants must all be legal adults, that objection goes away.
So I do think that part of that comes from the fact that you can get pregnant and start a family before you turn 18. And I say as someone who knows a lot of people who did get married at 15, 16, et cetera, some of whom are still together, and most of whom we're now in our 30s, definitely divorced, sometimes 2 or 3 times by this point. So I think that I don't completely agree with you on the age, but I think generally speaking, that age requirement is very useful because it can be, a lot of people are preyed on in that way. And I think there's a difference between 2 15-year-olds who still ideally shouldn't be getting married or starting a family because it does cause a lot of problems for most of them, and someone who's like 60 marrying a 15-year-old.
You also see this resurgence on Twitter, and it feels like it's becoming more common. You see this resurgence every few weeks where people talk about how your brain's not really finished developing until 24 or 25.
Yeah.
And, maybe we should be bumping up all these ages of consent and ages in which, you get to exercise the rights afforded to you. We should be bumping those, that age up by 6 or 7 years, which I am just hugely, staunchly against, in part because I'm 24. I'm about to turn 25. I've been exercising my right to do all kinds of weird things for quite a while now. And the idea that I'm somehow making unformed or half-formed judgments, it feels incredibly paternalistic and condescending for people to act like that's an appropriate way of doing things. If anything, we need to be doing this sort of Lenore Skenazy type approach of making sure, kids and teenagers are well prepared to assume the responsibilities that come with adulthood when that happens when you turn 18. There are also libertarians who disagree with all of this and see this all as super arbitrary.
I was just gonna say that brain plasticity lasts your whole lifetime. So actually your brain is always changing until you die. So tell people that. Christian, do you have anything you wanted to comment?
I was gonna say, it's interesting that we keep going to this trope, back to this trope of the Mormons and the compound. Because one of the things that we were discussing is about legalization of polyamory. And so my brain instantly goes to the fact that politics is downstream of culture, right? So we see these images of how we look at poly relationships and how they're viewed. And so most people, their only public exposure was watching Big Love, or they've seen some off-color joke about an old couple who retired to Florida and lives the lifestyle, But if you're a queer person, you have always known very normal, adjusted couples who live in poly relationships. And guess what, kids? They live among you. They have super powerful jobs. They bag your groceries at Publix. They're everywhere. They might not broadcast it, but lots of people are in ethically polygamous relationships. It's not for me, and it's not my preference. But since the state has decided to attach benefits and preferences to relationships, these are something that everyone should be entitled to. But I was just interesting how we kept going back to that trope. And so I think one of the barriers to legalization here is that there are not positive images in culture of people that live poly relationships.
Yeah. And I think what you mentioned too about people may not advertise it is a big part of that. There are so many different reasons why, if you choose not to follow a very strict lifestyle norms about any number of things, right? We're changing on some of these, but any number of things. And certainly when it comes to your sexual or romantic leanings, there are many ways in which you can be punished, not just legally, but culturally, socially, all sorts of things like that. And so it's very difficult for people, especially people who I think are in more well-adjusted relationships, relationships where they're truly happy and they might be, in the type of American dream type setting. They have so much more to lose a lot of times from letting people know what their actual views are or how they actually choose to make decisions in their lives.
Well, I mean, this is something, Kat, that certainly impinges on my own situation, and sex workers in general, is that we see these things where people say, well, I don't know any sex workers. And of course, our stock answer is, you probably do. They just haven't told you. Because a lot of people do sex work at some point in their lives, a tremendous number. I mean, we don't know the exact statistics, but the best working statistic we have is that 1% of women in the West have done sex work at some point in their lives, and as many as 10% have taken money for sex at least once. With men, it's a little harder. The numbers are kind of more iffy, but with women, that's which of course, and obviously our society, all of our prostitution laws are mostly assuming that the sex worker is female. So the fact that that about 10% of all sex workers are male is neither here nor there to the law, because the law doesn't care. The law acts as though all sex workers are female and all clients are male, even down to the point of the rhetoric. Prostitution is violence against women, that sort of thing. Whereas of course it's not the real situation. But so we have the same situation that you're talking about with that Christian was talking about with the images, in the sense of everybody's idea of sex workers is stuff they saw in movies, because the sex workers who are well-adjusted and have farms on the Washington coast and animals, and we don't, for the most part, say anything, because we don't want people to, and I'm guilty of this myself. I mean, when I lived in New Orleans, I lived in the half of a double shotgun, with this very, very nice young Christian couple who would often ask me to babysit their baby and things like that. Now, would they have asked me that if they'd known I was a hooker? Probably not. And my husband at the time asked me, do you think we should tell them ethically? And I said, honestly, they were very young and their worldview was fairly narrow and they were nice people. But I'm like, I honestly think that's throwing more on them than they are ready for. If they came to me and asked me point blank and were trying to figure something out, that'd be a different situation. But I honestly feel like it wouldn't have been nice. It would have been a little cruel to try to throw that ethical conundrum at them at that earliest stage in their ethical development.
It's funny because when you had said earlier that like lots of people know sex workers, they just haven't told you. The
Right.
first thing I thought of in my mind, especially as we all nodded along, and I thought of a few sex worker friends who opened up to me by nature of me being libertarian, which is, really, I don't know, kind of an honor that they feel comfortable. But it's funny because the first thing my mind jumped to was, holy crap, I know a bunch of evangelicals in Austin who absolutely don't know a sex worker. And wow, there's a lot of pent up demand in that community. Not that they would ever admit it, but I was just thinking, like, for all of us, it's like not a crazy thought, thinking like, yeah, there are a whole bunch of sex workers among us engaging in various forms at different times based off of what suits their lifestyle and their needs. But there are a bunch of people, I guess, in different communities where maybe that's not fully true. Like, we're probably a slightly different set. But I think it is like what you're tapping into is that this is so much more common than people think.
Yes, very much so.
But that's, interesting that you guys both brought that up in the context of sex worker and, more open or poly relationships. With the sex worker thing, one of the things, but I'm saying like both suffer from this weird stigma. I think one of the things with sex work is that people really assume like if you are a sex worker, then like that's who you are for your whole life. Like they don't think that it can be a thing that people casually get in and out of, which is just not the experience of so many people that I've known.
I know a lot of sex workers who also have white collar jobs, which I think is one of the things that like really would surprise people. And of course, they're not telling you because they like their white collar job.
So I was going to ask, and you guys are being great because you just keep answering the questions that I was going to ask without even having to ask them. I love it. But Maggie, I was going to ask you, why, and you've sort of touched on this, but maybe if you want to expand a little, why do you think that it seems like the movement for sex worker rights and destigmatization should be very naturally fit into this other movements for sexual autonomy and other sort of free love movements in the United States? And it really hasn't, if we're talking about back in the pre-Victorian era, or if we're talking about today, it's been really hard. Whereas in some other countries it has. So do you have any thoughts about why that has been so difficult to conceive of it as part of this broader movement for rights?
Yeah, I think the reason is hierarchy. And for those who aren't familiar with the term, hierarchy is a term that we use for the idea, and it's a very, very pernicious idea, and it's a very damaging idea, that there are strata in sex work, that there's a hierarchy from the highest sex workers down to the lowest sex workers. With the highest sex workers being the ones who not just make the most money, but have the least contact with clients. Mm-hmm. So the idea that that a porn performer, for example, is above an escort because they have sex with fewer different people, and that a street worker is lower than an escort because they have less discrimination and they charge less. And so there's this idea, this you know, of these strata. And the big problem with that is the government has legitimized, to a degree, has legalized some forms of sex work and not others. And so that makes the natural tendency to want to make these hierarchies even worse, because now you have, oh, well, I'm better than you because I'm legal. I'm legal. You know, my job is legal. And they wield this like a club. They really wield this word legal like a club, like, you know, they like that it is making them better than other people. And what that has to do with the question you asked is that because of these lines, because of these strata of legality and social acceptability and stigma, a lot of sex workers want to draw these imaginary lines in the sand. I am better than you because I'm legal. I'm better than you because I don't take money. I'm better than you because I do this for religious reasons. I'm better than you because, oh no, I only have sex with lots and lots of people for fun and not for money, and that makes me better. I only have sex with people on camera in a big Hollywood movie, and it has to be simulated sex. So that makes me not the same as you. And the fact of the matter is, of course, is that all this stuff is one big continuum, and people want to draw these fake lines to divide it. And so I think the reason you see sex work rights not being pulled into the greater spectrum of free love and sexual rights in general is that there's way too many people that are not sex workers and want you to know that they're not sex workers, and they're willing to draw that line. And it may be that they're opposed to the government interference in a lot of other ways, but boy, they'll be the first ones to stand and say, oh no, well, that doesn't apply to you. I remember having an argument with online. Didn't last very long because I don't waste my time with it, but I was very surprised. These young lesbians from Tasmania, of all places, and they were very, very young. I could tell they were extremely young because they honestly believed, and Christian's going to guffaw at this one, they honestly believed that the biggest struggle faced by gay men prior to 15 or so years ago was not being able to get legally married. They knew nothing. They knew nothing apparently about HIV. They knew nothing about the cops that used to beat guys up, and they knew nothing about any of that stuff. Nothing.
Forced castration.
Not until last year you could fire someone for being a homosexual.
No, they knew nothing about this. Nothing. And so they were perfectly willing to be authoritarian with regard to sex work because they were on the other side of the legal line, and they were perfectly happy for that to be that way.
I always thought that the distinction too between porn being legal and other, which is basically full service sex work in many really simple ways, and other forms of full service sex work being illegal, was always sort of like a Nathaniel Hawthorne-ish Scarlet Letter thing too. Like, well, we've got on camera that you did this, so we always know that you're that kind of person, versus like, we can't quite tell whether or not you've done it if it happens behind closed doors.
Right.
I like
who knows what Maggie's doing? I mean, nobody knows because I don't tape it. I don't film
We're
it.
talking about all of this from the perspective of like, on a principles level, an authoritarian response doesn't make sense. But we could explain this entire argument to somebody who is authoritarian, and they would be like, yeah, you're right. We should make porn illegal.
I know. Well, there is a growing movement for that too. And I'm personally not a big fan of porn, but I definitely think it should be legal.
So Y'all, we're getting rapidly near the end here, and I want to ask everyone one more question before we answer maybe one or two audience questions. So if anyone in the audience has any more questions, I see one in here in the chat, but if anyone else has one, please put them in the chat right now. But before we end, I wanted to ask each of you to say if you think there are any underlooked issues, what am I trying to say here? Issues that we don't talk about enough that relate to free love, things that don't get a lot of attention, that maybe we haven't even mentioned here yet tonight, but that you think fall in this rubric of things that we should be paying more attention to and fighting for. And so, yeah, let's start with Christian.
This is going to be a cross that I will carry to like the end of my days, which is bisexuality is real. It's okay. It's not a stop on the way to gay town. It's actually a way that people live. And so I think it's like really good and important to think about that in terms of relationships for people. And I also think that our denial of bisexuality contributes to a lot of later frustrations for people in their marriages and in maintaining monogamous relationships because they were never able to express. So that's mine.
Thank you.
I would like to go off of that and just say, like, I know this is just a typical libertarian feminist talking point, but people are individuals. People want very different things. People feel very different ways about things. And the more we try to put people into boxes, you can do it. You can force people into boxes. It might take a little bit of actual force, but it'll happen. The less people are actually happy, the more cheating happens, the more oppression happens, all sorts of things. I mean, I think we hear things like just ranging from types of sexuality, types of marital agreements, gender roles, types of gender expressions, all sorts of things that people have these
Types
very
of
clear.
sex, like
What?
Types of sex, like people talk
Types
about
of sex,
people have a hard
right?
time
Yeah.
believing that people could like a kind of sex that they don't like rough sex.
Exactly.
They don't like
Exactly.
it. Nobody could like that.
And we're all just so unique. And I think that it's really important that we give space for people to, you know, really embrace themselves and live authentically to themselves and understand that even if it may not be something that we like, you don't have to participate.
Liz, Maggie?
I think,
I
go ahead, Maggie.
I did mine back at the beginning, which was my thing about why should boinking be privileged was my big. I don't think enough people talk about that. You know, there's always the assumption, even when people talk about things like free love, there seems to be this unsaid assumption that sex is special and sex is magic, and with the existence of reliable birth control and accessible abortion, no, it's not special and magic. You know, back in the days when you could get stuck for life by having sex, yeah, okay, I agree. It was definitely special in those days because it was the only act that could potentially saddle you with another human life forever. But now that's not necessarily so. And so why do we keep giving sex this privilege is I guess my thing.
I know I already went, but I really want to expand on what Maggie said because I have so many thoughts. Yes, but I think also we have these ideas of like marriage is for sex and like marital relationships are about sex and that you have to have sex in these relationships or that sex is the most important thing of a relationship and all of that too. And I think that can also be just really harmful for people.
I think my number one thing is that, well, two things. Number one, couples should go to counseling. Couples should go to therapy. Like, I think we should just normalize and destigmatize this to a far greater degree than we have. It's astonishing to me that people don't pursue sort of like a third party independent arbiter for more of their disputes. Like, I just think it legitimately can make you have a much like happier, more harmonious marriage. And it's not a sign that something's wrong. It's a sign that, you know, therapy is useful. That's all it means. I think the other thing is that a lot of people have bad sex and a lot of shame around sex. One thing that I really like about being steeped in sort of like, I'm not personally evangelical, but I have lots of friends within that culture and I have lots of poly-libertarian friends. One of the things I respect and appreciate about my poly friends is that it feels like their exploration and their interest in exploration helps people examine what good sex looks like for them and what it looks like for partners. I think it's really weird how within like monogamous heterosexual world, there's not as much discussion of what good sex looks like. I think in queer
Not
community,
at all.
There's not much good sex too. I mean, just
yeah, right?
statistically.
But like this is something where I notice queer friends and poly friends talking about this way more than I notice monogamous heterosexual friends. And it's confusing to me. It's weird, especially how much of like US evangelical and Christian culture goes straight from like purity culture and masturbation shaming to, well, sex is okay after you're married. But then there's very little attention paid to like how sex is a huge part of life and it's worth doing well. And how many people are out there having bad sex or not knowing, like so many people probably live without ever knowing what good sex feels like.
Oh, so
and,
many.
Like
So
this is
many.
true. This has been true over the centuries, but like we have the technology, we have the free information. We can fix this. It's a fixable problem. And it's just something, I think to me, free love very much means working to create a culture that has better sex and that doesn't criminalize certain types of sex, and that just focuses on sort of learning some of the lessons from queer and poly communities and replicating those in other communities.
I also just really hate the idea that sex is just like what I would refer to as like PIV sex, like a penis goes in a vagina and that's it. Like there are so many sexual activities of various types that I think have various risk levels, various pleasure levels, and we just like pretend that they don't exist or that they're only for teenagers who aren't yet married.
Well, there's also the thing too of trying to define sex, because of course of sex laws you need to, and when you start reading into them, they really get quite funny sometimes when you start talking about things like politicians trying to legislate what kinds of touching are legal for masseuses, and so then they start with the delineating body parts. And well, you can touch a person here, but you can't touch a person 3 inches closer to the hips than that, because this is sexual and this is not sexual. And you start getting these crazy lines that people are drawing. It's like, well, is this sex? And does it matter?
You even get that in like breastfeeding conversations, right? Like people are like, oh, well, it's an erogenous zone. And like, yeah, sure, but so are your ears and your ankles.
Right.
Well, this is even like an editorial decision that, like, I don't know, people at Reason think about, which is like, especially when writing about Title IX and sexual assault cases, describing something as sex of like so-and-so, you know, had sex with so-and-so. And we're trying to be clinical and we're trying to be accurate and we're trying to be descriptive. But there's also this component, I remember it came up one day as like an editorial decision of like, oh, well, somebody gave somebody else a blowjob. It wasn't P&B sex. Should we, you know, define that as sex? And it's like, well, wait a second. If we only define P&B sex as sex, there's a whole segment of the population that has never had sex or doesn't regularly have sex. And so it's interesting to even think from like a journalistic editorial standpoint of, you know, what does that look like and how do we be precise and clear, but also not contribute to this, this very narrow definition of what that looks like.
Just let's get to one question from the chat here.
We're very chatty.
Someone asked at the beginning of Kat, but sort of say it to everyone. If the legal definition of marriage would change depending on the benefits afforded to married people, and if that would change your opinions on it.
Sure.
Yeah, it says, would your position on expanding the legal definition of marriage change depending on the benefits afforded to married people? It seems obvious that we want to expand the definition of marriage if married people are afforded tax credits, but it is not obvious that we want to prefer this if married people are given subsidies.
So they also expanded on that in private message to me. Their point was, should subsidies be any sort of benefits for being married be expanded to everyone outside of things like a tax credit? So I think they're looking at it on the fiscal level. I would say that in as much as anybody who considers themselves married, because I do think that marriage looks very different from marriage to marriage, even if you're looking at legal marriage, they should get those same benefits. Now, I also think that really the major problem is that the state needs to not be privileging certain types of relationships against other types.
Yeah, I mean, so, what about no benefits, right? Like, I think my ideal situation would be drastically reducing these sort of nudges that we give people in favor of what Maggie outlined earlier, which is like the government exists to enforce contracts between people. And I have a hard time with the concept of benefits. If we are going to have them, of course they should be applied equally to people in queer marriages and in poly marriages, but I really struggle with like, why does the government need to be giving benefits in the first place?
So before we leave, I just want to tell everyone, well, first, thank you to our panelists so much. This has been a really interesting discussion. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. We are Feminists for Liberty. You can find us online at feministsforliberty.com, or you can find us on Twitter at feministliberty, just no S on the end. We couldn't get the S. Everywhere else on all the other social, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram, we are Feminists for Liberty. And I'd like to ask all of our panelists to go and tell people where they can find you or how they can get in touch with you if they would like to follow up with any questions or anything like that, or just follow your work. Start with Maggie.
Oh, okay. The easiest way to find me, because it's just so promiscuous, it's Google Maggie McNeil. Seriously, you can see how I spell my name. If you Google that, you will find my blog, you'll find the videos, you'll find my book, you'll find my documentary, you'll find everything. You can go to Amazon and Google Maggie McNeil too, and you'll get the same thing. Although you will also get a woman who, by the same name, who writes romance novels. I didn't write those.
It's so close though.
So close, so close.
Find me on Twitter at @chertz. Please follow. Lots of gay jokes.
Liz?
You can find me on Twitter at LIZZYWOL. My username was made when I was 14. Now I have a blue check mark. Life comes at you fast. Really wish I was some sort of variation, like Liz Wolfe 2 or something would have been slightly better, but you know, it is what it is. I actually also have an alternate universe Liz Wolfe, like you were talking about, Maggie, who is a writer, who is a nutrition, and she keeps chickens as well. And so if you Google Liz Wolfe—
Isn't she a chemtrail?
What?
Isn't she a chemtrail conspiracy theorist too?
She's really like whole earth, like it's real fun. But she's a brunette, so you can sort of keep us straight. She also talks all about fertility. So I've never written about fertility, not one bit, but similar situation.
That is good to know. So you can find me on Facebook or Twitter as @Kat Murti, and I'm also going to double up on Ian B's request. All of you, please follow Feminists for Liberty on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. This video, I know some of the people in the chat said they came in late. This video will be up on our YouTube channel, Feminists for Liberty. And if you enjoyed this panel tonight and you'd like us to put on more like this and continue our work, please make a donation. We are a nonprofit and we're entirely funded by donors like you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.